Welcome, everyone. Welcome to our Zoom audience. Welcome to our in-person audience. I'm Debbie Nelson. I'm the Dean of the Arts and Humanities here at University of Chicago. And before I start, I just want to say I'm really, really happy to be in a room and plugged in with you online to be talking about something meaningful, something that affects all of us and that we all think about, and to not be doom scrolling on my phone. So let's just take the relief of this moment of being together to talk about something that means a lot to all of us. I want to tell you a little bit about the Dean Salon. The Dean Salon is something that got started a number of years ago by my predecessor. And what I want it to do is to demonstrate how important the humanities and the arts are to understanding the world that we live in right now. So you might not think, oh, I have to read a novel in order to understand the housing issues in this country, but as it turns out, maybe you should. And so that's why we've brought together the people that we have. We want to have a more integrated and outward-facing division. And that means bringing our community of scholars and artists into more conversations with our faculty, staff, students, alumni, and friends, our neighbors in Washington Park and in Hyde Park and in the rest of the city of Chicago, and with our Zoom audience with people around the country and across the globe. And we can do that, and we're doing it more and more. I want to give you an example of what this better integration does. Some of you, either online or here in the audience, attended A Raisin in the Sun. And A Raisin in the Sun, a 5-star review at Court Theater, extended over and over again for its rapturous audiences that were attending it. Lorraine Hansberry, who wrote A Raisin in the Sun, her father was the first person to challenge redlining in the city of Chicago in a case that went all the way to the Supreme Court, and that house is around the corner, right? So we are right in ground zero of some of these issues around race and real estate. So we're here today to talk about the curious attachment to the American dream of the American single-family home. And I think that we can better understand it when we bring these different disciplines together. So we have to have an understanding of what the cultural imagination is. It's not necessarily or always or ever a rational decision to buy a home. We have to understand the racial realities of housing in this country. And we have to understand the way that's actually impacted the policy decisions that we make about housing. So this whole thing was prompted by Adrian Brown's book called The Residential is Racial. Adrian is a very long-time colleague of mine in the English department. That's where we both grew up. And she is also a faculty member in the Department of Race, Diaspora and Indigeneity, and the director of Arts and Public Life, and you have maybe gotten a tiny taste of Arts and Public Life on the arts block here. Some of you took the tour. Some of you hopefully will be able to make the journey at another time. She is joined today by a colleague of hers and someone that she's been in long conversation with, Robin Bartram. She is a scholar at the Crown Family School of Social Work, Policy, and Research. She has a book called Stacked Decks about urban housing policy. And so they have a lot to talk about from their various and different vantage points. So the format today that we've been using is that both Adrian and Robin will tell you a little bit about their work for about 5 to 10 minutes. And then we'll have a few questions just to flesh out some of the arguments they're making, some of the examples that they're using, so we can dig a little deeper into that. We have some questions that you submitted online, and that we'll draw on some of those, and we'll also then take some questions from the audience. So I'm going to give this to Adrian.
I got it.
All right.
Thanks, Debbie. All right. Well, before I start, so good to see everybody. Thanks for coming out today. If this is your first time on the Arts Block, we hope you come back many, many, many times again. There's always something interesting, amazing, innovative happening in our spaces. If you're a regular, I see some people who I've seen many times on the Arts Block, welcome back. Okay, let me dive in. All right. I'm going to begin with a quote. It's a little small, but I'll read it to you if you can't see it. This is a quote that's long haunted this book that Debbie mentioned, The Residential is Racial, which is what I'm going to talk about today. And it felt like if I could understand this quote, I could understand something about race, property, home ownership that I didn't know before. So this quote is by Herbert Hoover, who was the president at the time in 1931. This is from his address to the White House Conference on Home Building and Home Ownership. This is the middle of the Great Depression. So many residential properties are in foreclosure. Values have dropped. So he's giving this big speech to promote home ownership. And it's the first president to really actively do that. So this is part of what he says. There's a wide distinction between homes and mere housing. Those immortal ballads, Home Sweet Home, My Old Kentucky Home, and The Little Gray Home in the West, were not written about tenements or apartments. They are the expressions of racial longing, which find outlet in the living poetry and songs of our people. And he goes on to say, to own one's home is a physical expression of individualism, of enterprise, independence, spirit. We do not, in our imagination attached to a transitory place, that expression about a man's home being his castle. Okay, so there's a lot going on here. When Hoover gave this address in 31, the idea that the U.S. would become a nation of homeowners was not preordained. The U.S. would become majority homeowning by the 1950s, but in 1931, that looked a long way off. Most Americans did not own their own homes, nor necessarily desired to. As more people moved to the cities where they worked outside of their homes, homeownership did not as readily appeal to their hearts, minds, or pocketbooks as owning land once had. And actually, between basically 1880 and 1920, the homeownership rate in the U.S. was declining. It was not a drastic decline, but it was on the decline. So Hoover, first as Commerce Secretary, then as President, insisted the government help Americans change their tune. He did this, however, not by claiming homeownership as an inherently American sentiment, right? But he instead frames it as a racial longing that both precedes and supersedes the nation, which to me, that's the thing where I was like, what does that mean? Where does that come from? What is he thinking about? What is he drawing from to make that claim? And why is he using song lyrics as his evidence at this very social science-based conference, right? There's so many confusing things about this quote. Hoover's lyric-based evidence of the racialized desire to own, I think, already starts to attest to the role that aesthetics, feeling, and changing norms around racial perception were already playing in propagating mass homeownership in the U.S. And this is before the New Deal, before the state, the federal government starts to get deeply involved in redlining and all the things that would follow, right? So this is 1931. So understanding modern homeownership's early and ongoing organization around this property-centered notion of racial longing yoked to whiteness is one of the things that I've been thinking about in this book. Its earliest chapters recover the case built for mass homeownership in the early 20th century as it drew from centuries worth of theories defining whiteness as an innate desire for property and the inherent talent for its management, as well as limiting those outside of whiteness as insufficiently hungry for property or incapable of its maintenance. As the case for home ownership was built, really starting in the 1900s, older rhetoric about the racial sensibility of property that goes all the way back to the Enlightenment helped shape modern maxims of mass homeownership, how it should feel and who it should belong to. So trying to tie these much longer ideas about race and property and the ways that race and property emerge as categories together in the early modern period were already defining each other from the start. The way that those theories going back to John Locke, Adam Smith, about who has the capacity to own being yoked to whiteness and being used to make the arguments for things like chattel slavery, settler colonialism, that's the same theories and ideas that early realtors and early bureaucrats are drawing from when they're starting to make the case for mass homeownership and think about the rationale for redlining, et cetera. So to understand this kind of modern story, you kind of have to put it in this much larger context of race and property that goes back centuries. But the other thing that I'm really interested in this project is how homeownership changed the perceptual norms and interpretive possibilities of race more broadly, remaking how racial evidence was located, described, read, and given meaning. So let me tell you what I mean by that. So historians and social scientists continue to reveal the extent to which racial policies and theories shaped almost every aspect of residential life. Right? This is a story that we've heard for a long time from historians, from social scientists, et cetera. But these histories focused on policies and procedures have not fully captured how the project of mass homeownership fundamentally changed how Americans perceived full stop, but especially in relationship to race. That mass homeownership changed the way that people were taught to see, to invest, to value, and think about the world around them. While race certainly played a foundational role in the creation of mass homeownership, I'm kind of interested in the opposite, the role mass homeownership played in altering the definition, perception, and value of race. As the fever for homeownership took hold in the 1920s, aided by state incentives, and the home increasingly became the largest investment that most Americans would ever make, imperatives to make race more cleanly legible and easier to see and appraise grew too. By mid-century, homeownership had remade not just who counted as white, but the very measures of whiteness itself, moving away from blood and ancestry and toward performance, appearance, and location. So in contrast to the late 19th and early 20th century, where there's a lot of panic, right, about passing Negroes in the city. If you've read novels from that period, right, they're filled with gestures and ideas around secret Negroes, right, who appear white, but there's a taint in their bloodline. Like even a novel like Great Gatsby, right, that's at the core of what that novel in some ways is about, going back to something like the one-drop rule. Mass homeownership changes the ways that people are thinking about, describing, and talking about, and literally measuring race. By the time you get to the mid-century, residential regimes fetishize the appearance of race over hunting for black ancestors hidden in one's bloodline, right? It's like if you look the part and you've invested your money and you're willing to uphold segregation, you're good, right? So it changes the ways that people think about race in a more appearance-forward, investment-forward way of thinking about racial definitions. Market value relied upon the sense of a place as glimpsed by potential home buyers on the sidewalk rather than deep knowledge of residents' backgrounds, information proving harder to come by in new mass suburbs where everyone was new. Mass homeownership transformed what it meant to both sense race and be sensed as race, de-emphasizing rules of heredity, like the one-drop rule, to usher in more fungible, if no less inflexible, understandings of race distributed across appearance and increasingly place. So telling this story about homeownership, treating race not just as like a constant that was being responded to, but as something that was changing in relationship to homeownership, that was being re-optimized by residential space and markets, entails reading the practices of realtors and bureaucrats who are drawing from theory, history, philosophy, alongside the work of artists and writers, learning to newly represent the racial sensorium in the age of mass homeownership. And so that's why, to me, thinking about this broader archive of homeownership and thinking about the residential imaginary that moves across appraisal manuals and redlining maps, but also writers, artists, painters, helps us understand how people were learning to see race differently in the wake of mass homeownership. So, for instance, rather than approaching redlining as a mode of, as something that's just policy, right? And redlining names the practice of devaluing certain neighborhoods in relationship to their racial makeup. I approach redlining as a mode of sight, a mode of perception that altered what it meant to sense race and assign it value. So I think there's a tendency when you look at these maps, right, to think of them as factual documents that tell us something about, that were based on some sort of reality about who was living in what neighborhoods. But these maps really just tell us about the perception of the people who are on the ground providing the data to serve these maps, right? So if they're going around and saying, okay, who lives in this neighborhood? How are they deciding, right? Are they going and asking people? Are they looking? Are they just making judgments based on what's available, right? So like, what is the racial imaginary that they're using to make judgments about who lives where? And so I read a lot of appraisal manuals to try to understand how appraisers are being taught to do this work. And you learn about the racial imaginary and the residential imaginary in that, which I can talk about. But just that gives you a taste of what I'm trying to think about here. Resituating residential discrimination as a key moment within the history of perception and aesthetics, as well as policy, demography, and democracy, we get an even more expansive picture of both its origin and its impacts. The racial honing of neighborhood perception on the scale of the block, seeing race like a bureaucrat, an appraiser, and a homeowner became central to the functioning of the residential itself. So I'll stop there.
Thanks.
Thanks, Adrian, and thank you for the invitation to be here. I've been a fan of Adrian's work for a long time, long before I was here at UChicago, so it's really a pleasure to be in conversation with you, Adrian. So I study and teach about housing and inequality, and my first book, Stacked Decks, was a study of building code enforcement here in Chicago. But I'm not going to talk about that today, because these days I'm increasingly interested in how housing intersects with the environment. And I think it's pretty clear that there are a bunch of ways housing intersects with the environment, perhaps most clearly in ways that are captured in images to the left on this slide. Big disasters like wildfires and hurricanes obviously impact housing markets and housing affordability. We also need to be paying attention to things like environmental racism that have sited homes near polluting highways and industries, as well as left homes with lead pipes and without clean drinking water. All of these things are clearly really important. But the research that I've been doing for my next book project focuses on something slightly different, which is this routine dilapidation of buildings. Things like crumbling bricks, rotting floorboards, leaking roofs, the kind of things that happen to all buildings as they age without regular repair and maintenance. It turns out this is a really big deal. Almost 36% of all occupied housing in the US has at least one repair need, which equates to over 43 million houses across the country. I think this is a particularly significant issue now for a few reasons. First of all, the US housing stock is the oldest it's ever been. Second, the climate, things like excessive rainfall, high temperature, extreme temperatures is asking a lot of these old buildings. And third, the current high costs of labor and materials really makes repair and maintenance pretty unaffordable to a lot of people. And when repair and maintenance is unaffordable, it leaves people in real predicaments. And I've heard about many of these predicaments in the research for this book project, which has entailed interviews with homeowners here in Chicago and in New Orleans as well. So I've heard people talk about leaks and mold that cause daily headaches, exacerbate asthma and other respiratory issues. Parents have spoken about the anxiety of knowing their children are playing on floorboards that are rotting and loose. Elderly homeowners who paid off their mortgages decades ago are now suddenly fearing the threat of foreclosure, are taking on huge credit card debt, perhaps even going back to work because their homes need new roofs. And families are being denied intergenerational wealth because they're having to make the decision between paying for the mortgage or making necessary repairs. So for me, these interviews really expose a kind of stark reality about contemporary home ownership, which is that accessing home ownership, even paying off a mortgage, does not guarantee that homes remain affordable, an asset, or even a safe shelter. And I think this has two kind of big policy implications. The first is that I think it means we're underestimating the affordable housing crisis. We hear about this all the time, but I think we actually don't quite grasp the extent of it. These interviews really expose that being a homeowner, again, paying off a mortgage even, does not mean that your home is affordable. And secondly, I think this really calls into question policies aimed at increasing access to home ownership if we're not going to also help support owners long term. So increasing access to home ownership might take the form of down payment assistance, perhaps really trying to reduce or diminish racial discrimination in housing markets. Both of these things are obviously very important, but again, they're not going to help owners long term. And I think this has particular implications because so often we hear about increasing access to home ownership as a means to reduce the racial wealth gap. And I think we need to sort of think very, very carefully about what this really means. So the second thing I want to say, want to mention is my interviews with wealthy homeowners. So the main takeaway from these interviews is that their homes also pose significant issues in terms of leaks, in terms of plumbing, and structural problems too. The difference, obviously, is that they can access resources. They can tap into things like inheritance, home equity loans to be able to fix these issues. And the same is true for preventing flood damage. So this is a map depicting flood damage in Chicago, or at least one measurement of flood damage, at least. And we've all seen maps that split the city up like this. I mean, the redlining map wasn't that different. But I want to use it not to talk about the prevalence of flood damage on the south and west sides of the city, but actually to talk about the absence of it in whiter and wealthier neighborhoods. In some ways, these are the outliers on this map. These are the kind of phenomena that need explaining. So I've been thinking a lot about what it actually takes, the kinds of resources that people need to avoid flooding and other kinds of environmental risks. My aim is not to pat wealthy homeowners on the back for having these resources, but really just to highlight the extent of resources that are actually necessary. For example, things like back valves and sump pumps to prevent flooding can cost thousands of dollars. Beyond flooding, new roofs, plumbing repairs, things that will absolutely be necessary at some point over the course of any building's life can cost tens of thousands of dollars very easily. So by drawing attention to the resources as well as the labor, time, and effort that go into maintaining buildings, I really hope to show in this book that a maintained building is not the default or standard we should really be using. The default is actually for buildings to crumble, roofs to leak, and basements to flood, because that's what sort of material components of buildings do over time without intervention. So my overall point is that understanding just how much it takes to maintain homes helps us see why this is so out of reach for so many. And overall, I think this really points to the need to think a lot more comprehensively about what might count as homeowner assistance.
Great. Thank you. So I kind of love the story that goes from Adrian to Robin, is that on the one hand, we're looking at, like, the American dream is about the new home. It's not about the old home. And it is certainly not about maintaining that home over time. That is the most impossible and boring and difficult part of being homeowners. So Adrian, could you talk a little bit, how do we get from, so one of the things that sort of, the affordability of homeownership is really underneath all of this, that there's a kind of attraction to maybe getting out over your skis in terms of the financing of the home. And even if you're not fully anticipating the duration of ownership. So when did this kick in, sort of it's really a 20th century dream by and large. And I know from my own work, because I study the late 20th century, is, I always start a class on the post-war with a giant aerial map of Levittown. Levittown was a suburb in Long Island, and it was mass-produced home ownership in the most obvious way. They had 3 setups, and they just made, like a factory. It was like bringing factory methods to home ownership. Chicago was one of these places in the Chicago suburbs. So we're also talking about, so how, what was the selling point? I mean, obviously it's property, it's ownership, it's security. There's a lot of fantasies around that. But sort of what juiced that idea? Yeah. Especially after the Depression. You wouldn't think, oh, great idea, let's do that.
Yeah, well, maybe I'll start by talking about why people did not want to own their own homes before the big propaganda machine to make people want to own their own homes. So I mentioned that the homeownership rate was declining between 1880 and 1920. And there are a lot of good reasons for that. So if you own the land and you were a farmer, you own the means of production, right? You own the place where you were making your profit. When people were moving into the cities, moving off of small homesteads and working in factories, the home was no longer the means of production. They were working outside of the home. So the home was just a potential investment. And before the interventions of the state, the home was not that great of an investment. There was no 30-year mortgage yet. Most mortgage terms were 5 to 10 years. You had to pay 50% of the down payment up front, so it was really difficult to own your home. A lot of people didn't own their own homes till the end of their lives. When they retired, they saved up to do it, right? And home ownership didn't have the things that became attached to it, like citizenship, being a good citizen, and there were lots of other things you could invest in. This is also the moment when the stock market is taking off. So, the home is one place to invest in among many other possibilities in the late 19th and early 20th century. The state really starts to get involved in home ownership and understand it as a project, as an ideological project after the Russian Revolution. When people who don't have homes and don't have an investment in property revolt. And the U.S. understands this as a problem potentially here. How do we make sure that people don't want communism in the U.S., right? And homeownership was one way to prevent that. So the realtors had already been working on this for decades up to this point. Chicago is a key touch point for that. This is where the first national real estate guild forms, a National Association of Realtors. They're the reason why you have to put a copyright next to realtor. If you see it in print, they're the ones who own that copyright. They have incredible power. They're probably the private entity that has done the most to shape federal policy in the 20th century. And they started noticing that these homeownership rates were going down and needed a way to make people invest in their homes, right? So they started to partner with the state in the 20s to start these pretty blatantly ideological programs, right? Build better homes. Homes are beautiful. If you read these early guild and trade magazines, right, it's all about how to inflate this idea that the home is what makes people powerful. All those quotes we saw from Hoover, right? Independent spirit. No one writes about rent or tenements. And so that machine really starts in the 1920s. And then once you get the New Deal and mortgage insurance, that's subsidizing and incentivizing homeownership for not everyone, right? But for a certain class and race of people, then homeownership becomes massively affordable to match the kind of propaganda ideology machine that was accompanying that.
And so where I pick up the story, which then leads to Robin, is that there is a huge housing shortage after World War II because nobody had been building a house or making a car, doing anything from the Depression for 15 years, basically from the Depression in 1929 up through the end of the war in 1945. And they had all these GIs coming back, and they had a massive, massive housing shortage. So they put enormous investments into the building of the housing stock. And it was in primarily, but not only, single-family homes. And that's the birth of the suburbs in the way that we know them today. Why aren't we doing that, Robin? Like, if we think it's your problem now, if we think this is the solution, like this is the thing, we have a homelessness crisis, but we're not talking about multiple ways of solving. Now we're saying, like, we have some fixation in our minds that, well, everyone will need their own home, and yet we are not making the investments. And the kinds of homes we're building are not suitable for mass home ownership because they're huge and far from work. And so anyway, why are we not doing that? Why do we have a housing shortage? Can you solve this problem right now?
I don't know that I can solve it right now, but I mean, I think that this might be too simplistic of an answer, but I think it's because there's a lot of profit to be made in the kinds of homes that are getting built today. So that's the kind of answer. It goes back to sort of the origins of the story with the real estate industry that has sort of like been the consistent thread through this whole history of housing, mass home ownership, how we all had to be sort of sold this idea and subsidized, like, given money to actually, become homeowners. And the real estate industry has sort of continued to find different ways to make profit in different moments in history, responding to sort of different needs.
So I drive through this neighborhood all the time. You all drive through these neighborhoods or live in these neighborhoods. There's a ton of housing stock, just an absolute ton of housing stock. And it looks like that picture that was on the previous slide. So, like, we have a lot of houses. Why don't we have the rebuilding phase instead of building new houses? Or is it just a really bad idea to try to rehab old houses that need all new? I mean, may not be a faster way to produce housing that people need right now. Any thoughts about that?
I mean, I think it's not a bad idea. It's better in many ways. I think there are various studies of this that I think suggest it's cheaper to rehab buildings than build anew. It's better for the environment to rehab buildings versus demolishing and building anew. So it's a question, I think, that the real estate industry would sort of throw it back on the consumer and say this isn't what people want. People want, new buildings without a history of issues. And I think it also depends on the particular location and where again the real estate industry can sort of point to making the most profit.
So then this goes back to Adrian. It's like, how can we want things that are good for us instead of bad for us?
Well, we could answer that. We can answer a lot of problems in the world.
We want the new house.
Yes.
We want a house at all. Like,
this is the
where
thing,
are we
right?
going here,
I
right?
mean, one of the things that I trace in the book is actually this counter-imaginary of many people from the beginning of this moment in the 1920s saying, actually, we don't necessarily want like the reverse of what Hoover said, right? We actually just want housing. We don't necessarily want home ownership. We want people to be housed. And that means thinking, I think as Robbins has suggested, thinking about a range of ways to dwell, right? That home ownership is not the only, it's not the better way, it's not a privileged way of living. It doesn't mean you're a good person because you own your own home, that you're a better citizen, right? It is just one way of being housed among many other possible ways. And because the federal government has invested so much in home ownership as the privileged way that one should dwell, right? It has made it harder to access the resources to be housed in other ways. And as Robin is saying, getting a home is only the beginning, right? It's like, how do you stay in the house, right? All maintenance, right? We're both big fans of Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor's book, Race for Profit, which talks about, after the passage of the Fair Housing Act with HUD, there was a big push to get people of color into homes, which they were very successful at. What they were not successful at is keeping people there, right? That people are blamed, right? When they can't hold on to their homes, when they're not given access to the resources to be able to stay in those homes, right? And so I think it's about complicating that story of home ownership, which people have done over and over. I mean, we just talked about Raisin in the Sun, right? Lorraine Hansberry, no one knew more about housing, race in America than Lorraine Hansberry, right? She came from a family of kitchenette owners, right? Of real estate brokers and dealers, right? And that play to me is so much about her trying to grapple with the meaning and value of property and other ways of making meaning in relationship to history being in place, right? And so people have been thinking about how to think outside that American dream ideology for as long as that dream has existed.
But I think there's also another kind of material reason why people want the dream, and that's because whether or not it works out this way, home ownership has been sort of touted as the way to build wealth, personal wealth, and that is necessary in a society where the government does not provide free education, free healthcare. So there is a sort of material reason to want this dream as well.
Yeah.
Whether or not it works out that way is obviously a very different question.
Yeah, and I think this is in some ways the rub of the dream, right? Because again, Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor has written about the ways that white property is worth more than black property, right? We see the stories. It feels like every week or two there's a new story in the New York Times or Washington Post about appraisal, right? And a family who they kept up a picture of a black ancestor in their house, and the property is worth $20,000 less, right? Magically, right? So this idea that that you can build wealth through property, right? Even that idea, we see how property is actually distributed and valued and appraised, right? That black presence has been devaluing for property. So this idea that generational wealth is possible, right? Even that idea is very differential depending on who you are and when you've owned.
And the other side of that is that the whiteness adds value. So I think it's just an important, I always sort of try and remember this in my own head when I'm thinking about it and teaching about it. Like if we talk about the home ownership gap or the wealth gap, I want to think about both sides of that gap.
Yes.
Not just the sort of devaluing of black spaces, black homes, but also the sort of accumulation of wealth that is enabled through the whiteness on the other side of things.
All right. Let me just. So I wanted to, maybe explore what some of those alternatives are to the single family home. So we know that we have in a variety of ways been conditioned and in some ways refused to really look at the ledger and figure out how this works. But what are the alternatives and why aren't they more attractive, or can they is there a different story to tell about alternatives that you could tell us a little bit more about?
I mean, I can just say, sort of to go back to the other question, which is just that another reason why I think we're also attached to home ownership is because the alternatives aren't particularly great in this contemporary moment. But we could think about trying to make those alternatives better. So thinking about more protections for tenants, so renting isn't so awful. Thinking about things like rent control, Obviously, I would love to just make a strong argument for more public investment in housing, the management of housing, plus maintaining buildings that the government owns. But these are not. This isn't a sort of popular idea. But I think the good thing about thinking about the history of home ownership and the sort of relatively recentness of this and how we all had to be sold on home ownership is that maybe we can all be sold on something else too.
Yeah, Robin and I just did another conversation at the National Public Housing Museum, which is about to open in the spring. It's an amazing space. Everyone should go. It's beautiful. They're doing amazing work. Go. It's so good. But that is one way, right? To think about these other stories and histories of housing that already exist, right? And how do we celebrate and tell these stories about the creative, innovative, community-centered ways that people have dwelled outside of homeownership for a long time, right? So I think telling some of those historical stories are really important. I write a lot in this book about the particular pull of homeownership and property in general to the Black imaginary, right? Going back to the idea of 40 acres and a mule, right? That idea, like, get my 40 acres and a mule, right? Which is rooted in property, right? So how do we have different dreams of freedom, liberation, progress, right? That aren't attached to property. And there are good reasons why the Black imaginary is tied to property as a site of repair. It makes a lot of sense. But how do you think about other ways of thinking about repair and liberation? And that's also part of what I'm interested in thinking about and tracing these other imaginaries that people like Lorraine Hansberry, Richard Wright, W.E.B. Du Bois, Gwendolyn Brooks, the great Gwendolyn Brooks, who to me is one of the greatest theorists of urban space that we have, right? In her work, is constantly thinking about value, race, how we see our neighborhoods, how we take care of them, how people inhabit them, thinking about the way that property shapes the way that people live and thinking about alternatives. Like, her work is just such a rich resource. And so to me, the imaginary is filled with other ways to attach, other ways of thinking about how to live. And I think the question, how do we keep imagining and using that imaginary to help also change our policies, change what we want to see, change the ways that people invest, make the case to address these things in more structural ways.
Yeah, I think it's also to look to other countries and contexts as well. And I've seen various studies that sort of basically trace the correlation between home ownership and government spending on things like education and healthcare. And as those expenditures go up, as the government spends more money on citizens, the rates of home ownership tend to go down. So there are sort of examples elsewhere in the contemporary moment that we might look to as well.
Okay. I have a list of questions that I left in the green room.
Well, I have a question we could ask or answer. Is that okay, Debbie?
Ask me?
No.
Oh, ask me. No. You can go ahead.
Okay,
No,
good.
these are audience questions.
Yeah.
I just happened to leave them on the chair. So
this is one of those questions.
You go.
I remember one of the questions. It was about Chicago, and particularly about the University of Chicago's role in this history. And the university has played a key role in these conversations. And I will tell the historical story of this, right? If we think about, I already mentioned that the National Association of Realtors was rooted here on a lot of the theories, the economic and philosophical theories behind redlining and the rationale for residential discrimination were honed and perfected here in Chicago with the National Association of Realtors in conjunction with some key professors at the University of Chicago, right? The University of Chicago was really the intellectual powerhouse behind a lot of the residential discrimination policy. So someone like Homer Hoyt, who wrote his dissertation in land economics in Chicago in the 30s, would go to work for the Federal Housing Administration. He wrote about how blacks are the race that most devalues property. He brings those ideas with him to the FHA, and they become enshrined in the ways that they are funding mortgage insurance, right? So there's a direct tie between the University of Chicago and the kind of intellectual rationale behind residential discrimination. that we see the ripple effects of today. We could talk more about the university's other roles in terms of funding and investing in housing associations in Hyde Park and Kenwood and other places that made sure that made it difficult for Blacks to move into those neighborhoods, funding the lawsuits to fight against the overturning of covenants. There are lots of ways we could think about the university's role in this from the past through the present, but I think it would be a mistake if we didn't acknowledge the ways that the university has played a really key role in this history. Big role.
So I wanted to grab a few questions that you submitted, either you here in the room or some people that are online. And a bunch of questions sort of circulate around sort of the tenacity of the dream. And so can you and how can you, as a low-income person, purchase a home, right? They had not obviously listened to this talk. That question had been asked, but I wonder what there's a number of questions around that. Is this something that you can dream? Not just should you dream it, and you're saying, yeah, probably not, but
yeah, I mean, there are, because of the profit that is to be made from home ownership, and particularly selling home ownership to people who might not be able to afford it long term, there are various programs that offer things like down payment assistance to help people become homeowners. Mm-hmm. I think Chicago is a kind of an interesting story because it's sort of long been relatively affordable compared to other big cities, and also because of the prevalence of the 2 and 3 flat buildings, which have sort of been a way for people to be able to become homeowners while sort of bringing in rental income from additional units in the building. So there are a few reasons why there are sort of a few kind of ways in which home ownership is more affordable to low-income people, or is sort of made more affordable to low-income people. I think it's just the question, though, of like for how long does it remain affordable? And that's the sort of the big question in my mind.
There was another question that was related to this that was about multi-generational family home ownership. So one of the things that I often think about, just from my own work, is that one of the things that the housing boom and the suburbanization of the country, one of the things it did is that people were leaving multi-generational homes for single-family homes. And so there was the kind of, you see this in a lot of the culture at the time, a kind of loneliness epidemic. It's where you get the mom taking the little, mommy's little helper, Valium, where she's alone in her home with, there's a lot about this, but the isolation of the nuclear family and the kind of dream of it, and yet some of its consequences was to uproot you from that intergenerational home. Now, a lot of people were fleeing the intergenerational home too, because they were sick of living with their parents. So is there a space now, if we're thinking about people in the audience may be thinking what if the family, a multi-generational or a connected family, decided to buy a home? Is that a way to kind of spread the labor of maintaining the home, spread the costs of maintaining a home? And is that part of your imagination of alternatives as well?
I can't speak about this in the present, but what I can speak a little bit about is just how much, a term like, this isn't the term you're talking about, Debbie, but a term like white flight, to me is a kind of a misnomer, right? Because the idea is that there were people who were white in the cities who decided to move to the suburbs and live there, right? What is left, and it becomes a story about personal choice, right? To leave the multi-generational, multi-family home to live in the suburbs. What I think that story lets off the hook is all the incentives that pushed those families to leave the city, right? It was much cheaper to buy your home and live in the suburbs because you were eligible for FHA loans, right? That you could get if you lived in a white-only neighborhood. it was very hard to get good loans in mixed race neighborhoods or neighborhoods that were identified as being on the decline because they had more racial diversity, right? It was harder to get loans to maintain your home if you lived in those neighborhoods, right? So this idea that this is all just a matter of individual choice needs to be complicated, and it has been by people like Richard Rothstein and others, but this idea that that it's not just that white people decided that they just need to get out of the cities and leave, right? Those moves were highly subsidized and incentivized, right? And so much of those things that get codified and thought about as personal choice, right? We have to think about how many systems and structures enable and make those choices feel individual, right? And feel agential, though they were kind of part of these larger systems and structures.
I'll ask one more and then we'll open it up to the floor. We had a couple of people thinking about immigration and home ownership, and not necessarily, I guess this is more a question of cultural imagination necessarily than housing policy, but what part of the Asian cultural imagination is organized around home ownership or generational wealth and things like that, and have the, let's say, the post-1965 changing of immigration law that let in a lot of people from around the world instead of just Europe. How did that change the imagination of housing, or is there any kind of differences across immigrant groups and this dream that you could speak to?
So I could talk about just a couple of ways that this racialized idea of property, I've talked about it mostly in black and white terms in this talk, but just because those are the spectrums of value, right, that have organized the housing market, and that is not to ignore and visibilize the ways that homeownership is racialized for everybody. For thinking about Asian immigration in particular, I would go back to the Alien Exclusion Acts, right, which made it illegal for Asian non-citizens to own property. And the rationale for those laws in the 19th century, right, were about racialization and who had the capacity to own and who didn't, right? All going back to these larger Enlightenment ideas and theories. We would be remiss to be talking about ownership and property in the U.S. without thinking about indigeneity and thinking about Native peoples and reservations and allotment, which kind of forcibly privatized parts of the reservation, which made it easier to take land from Native people, right? So the story of race and property and race and home ownership is a very complex one that isn't only understood in black and white, but for me, thinking about thinking about blackness and whiteness is so important to this story because those terms are so important to real estate and appraisal and the ways that people were taught to see and learn how to value property. But that's not to say that property is always and has long been racialized for many different kinds of people. So, yeah, I don't know if you want to add anything, Rob.
No, I think that's perfect.
All right. Do we have questions from our in-person audience?
Thanks for the great presentation. I respect the work that Rothstein and everybody's done on the FHA and the kind of Levittown, the entire way FHA created a white-dominated homeownership. But I think there's been little research or emphasis on role of FHA. Perhaps you mentioned post-1970, Romney, HUD, or later, to actually promote black home ownership, sometimes at the point of the question of whether it was successful, but I think it has been, in relative terms, very successful compared to the private market providing mortgages. And I confess to being a bureaucrat. You mentioned I worked at HUD, I worked in the FHA on the multifamily side, but I saw how the single family program, imperfect at best, provided a great vehicle for high leverage loans where banks were not making the loans. And when the loan went sour, the FHA or the private lender would work with the borrower much more substantially than a private lender would. Maybe not to the point of avoiding foreclosure, but clearly more forbearance. So I just want to make a slight defense for the FHA. It is totally appropriately trashed for its pre-1964, maybe, I don't know where the break point is, and it never became perfect. But I feel that it has to be studied more affirmatively because the black wealth gap and the black disparity in home ownership of 12 to 20% would be even worse without the FHA.
Yeah, I mean, I think that your point sort of adds a contrasting angle to what I would have thought I knew about that period of time in the sort of trying to promote home ownership in the Black community. And because I think the story that we know largely from Keeanga Taylor's book, Race for Profit, is one of sort of predatory loans targeting particularly Black women for homes in bad condition. So sort of setting them up, for trouble to begin with, basically. So
This is the 70s, 80s
right,
moment.
right. So, yeah, so maybe slightly different timing, right? Yeah.
Fantastic. First of all, thank you both for the talk. This has been really, really fascinating. My name is Donovan. I'm a housing policy researcher and an alum of the Harris School. And a lot of my work focuses on some of the alternatives to single-family homeownership that you all have alluded to. So community land trusts, cooperatives, et cetera. And when discussing those ideas in predominantly Black communities, one of the challenges we run into is a sense of frustration that now that Black Americans have an easier time of accessing homes, the rules of the game are changing. And we are pushing an idea that, no, the home should not be a primary source of equity and you should find other ways. And so the question that I have, we've alluded to some of the tools of creating the cultural imaginary around homeownership. I was wondering if you all could talk a little bit more specifically about the role of media, literature, music, movies, culture in creating that cultural imaginary, and how we can deploy those same tools to create counter imaginaries.
Yeah, that's a great question. And again, one that I have tried to think a little bit about in the book. And one of in the epilogue, I end with the Poor People's March in D.C. So the Poor People's March was planned by Martin Luther King and by SNCC. King passes, and they decide to do the march anyway. They delay it a little bit. And the idea was to bring together a coalition of the poor to march to Washington and then to build housing on the Mall and be housed there, and to build a kind of ideal utopian city there while the constituencies who were there were protesting and putting pressure on Congress to pass a slate of acts to think about economic justice. That this is where King's imaginary was going at the end of his life, right? Really thinking about economic justice. And homeownership was playing an interesting role in that. That march is so interesting because they brought in architects from the University of Maryland to plan the housing and the encampments. It is often talked about as a failure, right? And because it rained heavily, the leaders moved out, and it was kind of forcibly shut down by the police after a few months. But if you look at the images from that moment, they're beautiful. People are talking about, we are here, we're housed, we're happy. People decorated their homes. There was so much press coverage, right? To think about this imaginary of a place where people across the color line, who are not trying to erase color, right? But think about how to live together outside of ownership. People had health care. It was a really community-centric way of envisioning a future for home ownership. And so it's moments like those where I think they were so aware of the press, right? So aware of what would it mean for this to be the hub for this movement, right? Moments like that to me feel so impactful, right? And recovering the power of those moments where people really have imagined other ways of living and dwelling and put serious thought and energy and activism into those moments are really important. So that's just one moment that comes to my mind all the time. I think you can see it in more subtle ways in works by people like Gwendolyn Brooks. If you know how to look for it, it's there. It's there everywhere. But also, the last thing I'll say about this is, the idea of the American novel, the great American novel that was set in a single family home in the 20th century. If you look at the literary landscape today, that is not what people are writing about. They're writing about tent encampments. They're writing about reservations. They're writing about all different kinds of ways of being housed. So if you look at the contemporary literary imagination, it is there, right? The single-family home is not at the center of the ways that people are producing art and literature these days. If we look at Chicago and the art scene here, Amanda Williams, Andres Hernandez, Theaster Gates, right? There's so many visual artists here who are asking us to think about the history and legacy and the failures of homeownership and imagining other ways of thinking and dwelling. So that work is happening around us all the time. And how do we name it and claim it as such, I think is part of the work. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Shatana Powell. I'm a curatorial fellow at the Art Institute in the Architecture and Design Department. And almost to play off the last question, how much of your research actually looks at the Black architects here? You named Amanda Williams, who's an architect, or like three of the names were architects that you just named. Yeah. Okay. So like, yeah, like the history of Chicago as an architectural city,
Yes.
even the history of these Black architects not being allowed to practice architecture. But if we're talking about counter narratives, the things that they did produce,
Yes.
yeah, how much of your research looks at that?
This is a great question. We should talk after. My first book is on skyscrapers, race and architecture and skyscrapers. And so I've thought a lot about race and architecture and these questions of perception and sight, or people are trained to think and see. And in that project, I think a little bit about Black architects, mostly in the early 20th century, and Black building imaginaries. And it's a similar kind of thing. Once you start to find it, it's everywhere. If we're not talking about licensed architecture is one of the most, I think the numbers are going up slightly, but it may be 2% of licensed architects are African American. It is a field that's been very slow in terms of training and hiring Black architects. And architectural history and theory has been very slow to think about race as a concept. That is changing, and Chicago has been at the forefront of changing that because of these great artists and thinkers who are here. Yeah, I could talk more about the project, but we should talk afterwards.
One last question.
Yeah, I want to thank the panel for this forum tonight, and I want to bring up a question about home ownership with college graduates.
Oh.
And let's talk about some of these. A lot of the students that are just finishing up graduate school, the debt that they carry. They're going to be homeowners. Mm-hmm. So we had in the early 2000s, like me, I owned 3 properties, right, at home, and I bought 2 condos. There was no docs, no credit checks. It was predatory lenders and unregulated markets that says, he's got a job, he's got a decent credit score, let's lend him some money to get him 2 more buildings that I just rented out. Mm-hmm. But we had a housing crisis right after that. So that's right on the turn of when George Bush was president, and we had 5 crises, and then Obama became president, and he had 5 fires to put out. But here's the thing. We still have those college graduates. So they're going to get married. They still have college loans. But these things are going to resurface because greed factor of unregulated mortgages come from LIBOR and other places. They're going to find their way back in and make sure that they give loans. But my question is, what's in place to try to make sure we have these kind of protections and regulations to keep people from being taken advantage of?
Great question.
I mean, very little, I think, is in place. I think something that I've been thinking about that kind of relates to the other question as well is a trend that I've noticed among students. So this might be a question of the kinds of students that are taking my classes about housing, but most of these students profess to not want to own homes in the future, partly because they think they won't be able to afford it, so it's just sort of like not even worth thinking about, but also because they want more flexibility in their lives, they want to be able to move around, they don't want the sort of 30-year mortgage holding them down. That might change, obviously, once they graduate, and 10 years later, they all might want to become homeowners. Or maybe we're seeing some kind of cultural shift. Maybe the material reality is catching up. But I think to your actual question, very little is in place to protect new owners.
It's harder to kick a tenant out. You got squatters that stay in properties for years.
Yeah. You can certainly ask your questions of Robin and Adrian. I want to thank them for their brilliant research and their great contributions to this conversation. Yeah, please join us, and we'll carry this on outside. Thank you very much.